Without further ado, Michael, take it over.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's good to see some familiar faces from far away. Let's see, is this working? Did I share that right?
It needs to be bigger.
Can everybody see this?
There you go. Perfect.
All right. Wonderful. I have enjoyed giving this presentation to people across the country and seeing old friends everywhere. It's been quite an unexpected pleasure. I had intended on doing a book tour, which was going to be by train, by Amtrak, and I was going to circle the country counterclockwise. It never happened due to COVID. This book was published in the early days of COVID, and I'm sure you're aware Jonas's book, The Little Book of Bonsai, was just before COVID. That one came out, so we both published a book last year. So I wasn't able to see friends in person, but I was able to see them on a screen. So that was kind of unexpected. But Zoom has brought many things to us. What I've done with this presentation this afternoon is to take just several of the chapters of Heresy and make a few points on each one. There's only about 12 of them. And then keep your popcorn brains going for questions, because at the end of each chapter, you can write in your questions into the chat, and then we'll have someone read. I can't remember. Is that going to be Dodi? Is that going to be you, or is that Renee? I'm sorry. You're all muted, probably. No, I apologize.
I will be monitoring chat for you, Michael.
Renee. Okay, yeah, great. Thank you.
I will be monitoring chat.
Awesome. So you type in your question, and then Renee will, at the end of the chapter, read it to me, and I'll attempt an answer, and then we'll move on to the next chapter. And of course, if anything comes up at the end, we can keep chatting then as well. So this book was written out of confusion of many years. I love this quote. I think we were fiddling around in the living room when I was telling my then apprentice, John, and my former apprentice, Andrew, who was still living in the studio house, that I was having trouble finding something to put on the back, whether it was some sort of image or something. And I forgot if it was Andrew or John, but they did a little search and they were looking for quotes. And one of them found this quote by Mark Twain, which summed it up perfectly. Education consists mainly in what we have unlearned, which is exactly the experience that I had. I've done everything wrong, including some things that you'd probably never heard of. And for those of you who haven't read this book, that's what the book is about. And I try to take each thing that I thought was something that maybe we can investigate a little further. Some things I had a clear idea about, but writing is edifying. And I did end up coming to, in some embarrassing cases, 180 degrees from where I thought I was going to be. And Jonas actually was a part of this. He saw one of the early, I will never do this again to any editorial team, but I had sort of a timeline. And so my content editors were reading something that no editor should ever read, which was the first draft rather than like third, fourth draft after the author goes through it a few times. So anyway, it was an absolutely unreadable piece of material. But Jonas and several of the other content editors did help me get to new understandings of this information. So it was actually, I think it came out to be a much better book because they were actually reading some early stuff that wasn't really cemented in yet. So in any event, I start the book with this first chapter. Bonsai methods should be exclusively based on science. And I put all the chapter titles in quotation marks because I believe the opposite of what this says. In fact, the whole book is fairly ironic. I asked Sergio Kwan to make illustrations that were like completely opposite of wabi sabi. So I don't know if that came across very well, but that was actually the intent, to be just totally ridiculous. But in this chapter, I tried to unpack the three things that we tend to do, which is three ways that we try to understand bonsai. One of them being science, another being anecdote, and I go a little deeper into explaining what I mean by that, and fantasy. And just take the first one. Science is certainly useful. There's so many ways that the results from science can help us understand why, when we do a pruning cut, the plant responds in the way that it does at that time of year, or because of the species that we have. Or, I mean, there's so many, and that's just one example, and there's a million things that it can help us with. However, science is not the thing that created black pine decandling, and that's a good jumping off place for understanding how bonsai tradition has actually been built, which is by anecdote. And you can use a different word if you want, but it's sort of this storyline that somebody's investigating, and they tell their buddy about it and say, this is what happened. This is kind of curious. You want to try that too? And then eventually a few people are trying it, and they realize that this is something that actually works. And this is sort of a trial and error. I mean, most of these things that we fiddle around with in our backyard don't work, but for those of you who don't know the story, there's sort of a fun little story of Sachi Suzuki. So this is a fellow of several generations ago in Boone's clan, Boone, Kathy Shaner's clan, who in the late 1930s watched some caterpillars nibbling away at candles in the springtime. And he watched these trees that year and discovered that they regrew their candles. And this was the beginning of an understanding that black pine was a double or multiple flush plant that could, without an awful lot of persuasion, grow twice a year. And there are not many plants that can do that unless you go into the tropics. But that's just an example of how bonsai tradition is created. It's created by, errors and fiddling around with things, but it's not really scientific method, which is, a very step-by-step sort of process. And then there's a third way, which isn't really a path. I try to debunk the idea that fantasy is a path to understanding bonsai, but we all kind of create these stories that don't really have an awful lot of evidence for them. One of them being, water drops on leaves, burning them, and things of that nature. Although we have some very bonsai specific fantasies, of which I've been a vector of myself. But I did want to encourage everybody to take notes. If you're fiddling around your backyard, take some notes. We don't have to really be doing science, so to speak, in quotations, but we can be doing what's called sort of citizen science, which is in our own backyard. So we're not covering all variables, for instance, we're not narrowing it down, but in our own backyard, what works? And that can be interesting information for other people to learn. And you might end up adding to the tradition. Many of the things that we do in bonsai are not as old as we might think. Jonas was a part of uncovering the story behind black pine decandling, which, surprising to me, was a lot older than I thought, from the 1930s, but still, it's not ancient, right? It doesn't go back 300 years or anything like that. So anyway, tradition is still being created, and you can be a part of it. Do we have any questions, Renee, for this first chapter?
No questions yet.
Okay. I think in the 6 times I've given this presentation, I have yet to get a question on the very first chapter. Okay. So chemical fertilizers versus organic fertilizers. When I first got into bonsai, there were like little skirmishes over these things. It was like wartime skirmishes about organic versus chemical. It was exciting. I was a part of that too. And I had opinions and whatnot. And then I grew kind of quiet for a few years because I really had no idea. I wasn't reading about these from people I might have gotten some details from, and in the bonsai community, there was less written about such things. So, so it was sort of futzing around in a kind of a fog, and it's really kind of interesting stuff to talk about. I interviewed a horticulturalist up in Seattle by the name of Linda Chalker Scott. Some people might recognize that name. She has a horticulture plant gardening debunking website, and she has some interesting things on there, some of which I thought were very interesting to talk about for their bonsai relevance. But one of the things that she said was a nutrient is a nutrient is a nutrient. The plant really doesn't care where chemical that it can use comes from. It can use organic or chemically equally well. The difference between the two is that one needs a significant amount of breakdown, organic, and much of the chemical fertilizer is available right away. I do have some opinions about I'm going to segue a little bit into something else, which is liquids versus solids. I highly recommend some form of a solid fertilizer if you can use it. The reason, and this is one reason I enjoy this presentation, is because I can talk about things that I didn't get into the book. It might be worthwhile doing a revision of, but one of the things that's really useful is because in bonsai we water so frequently that it's really easy to flush out all of the nutrition out of our soil and end up with sort of starved plants. And any kind of a solid fertilizer, whether it is a chemical such as Osmocote or Apex, the little tiny little pellet, round little things, or an organic, such as little cakes that you make or BioGold or something like that and place on the surface, either one of those is going to leach in a little bit of fertilizer every time that you water, and a little bit will probably leach out if you have a little bit of outflow. On the other hand, if you use liquids, which in some cases I'm using, the problem with that is that there's a little bit of a feast and famine kind of thing going on. Also, you can more easily program how much fertilizer each plant is getting. So we put so many cakes on this tree. Let's say we put 12 on this tree because it's young and we want to grow vigorous. We put 6 on this one because it's a little bit older, because it's a different species, or because it is too strong. And so we're trying to dampen the energy of it. So we put 2 cakes on it, for instance. So there are many reasons why we might want to adjust the level of fertilizer. Whereas if you're using something that's coming through your hose, a fertilizer that's being diluted through a hose, then it's a little bit harder to program. You have to have good memory. Did I fertilize this one last week? Maybe I shouldn't fertilize this. And then anyway, many of you may have better memories than I do. One thing that we did do is, out of curiosity of now I'm going back to the organic and chemical arguments, is how does it look visually? How do these two things change what we see in bonsai? And we get predictably more excitable about aesthetic things, or things that kind of influence aesthetics. So the question that I posed my apprentices was, let's devise a little citizen science experiment that explores any kind of visual difference between a few fertilizers that we were using. We had some cake fertilizers, and we had some liquids, fish, Dynagro, and there was a little a locally made cake. And so we compared all these, and we found that, yes, a chemical fertilizer bulks up faster for the same amount of nitrogen, gives you longer internodes. But the organics had some very interesting sort of subplots. Internodes were shorter. They didn't bulk as much or as fast, but there appeared to be more budding. And so you end up getting a denser plant, which, if you extrapolate that into what we want to do with particularly older bonsai, we want those internodes to shorten. So there's a whole bunch of things that can shorten internodes, but not over fertilizing, and not repotting too frequently, and not pruning too hard, for instance. All those things can help us keep shorter internodes. But one more lever to that is the option to use something like an organic fertilizer, which will which will keep those internodes short just by nature of how it seems to react with the plant. So anyway, there's that's citizen science because there's a whole bunch of variables that we weren't controlling. So anyway, that's an example, however, of the kind of experiments that you can do in your backyard. And I have a few. I'll come to them a little bit later of experiments that I would really like to know the answer to. So maybe we can talk about those. Renee, any questions about this chapter about fertilizing?
Yes, I have a question from Steve Vandeveld.
Okay.
He's asking how often I can use Clean Keep.
Say that again. Clean Keep?
Clean Keep. I've never heard of that.
I don't know this one. I
It's
don't know.
Kelp. Clean
Oh, kelp. Oh,
Oh,
kelp.
clean kelp. Clean kelp. Okay, excuse me.
Yeah, kelp is quite benign. I don't know that particular one, but most doses are sort of periodic rather than something that you're using every 5 days or something like that. It's not on a box with a label. Hopefully you can find that info online, but it's one of the products that you're not going to damage your plant by overdoing it a little bit. Where if you're talking about a chemical fertilizer that has some pretty high numbers on it, that's where you really want to be careful. So I know that's a pretty vague answer, but I'm not really familiar with this particular product. Kelp seaweeds are interesting. We'll talk about them in just a little bit under the growth enhancers chapter. Thank you for the question. Is there another one, Renee?
No, that's all for now.
Okay. All right. Keep them coming, everybody. Next chapter. Always top prune when repotting. Now, this is one that I learned when I was just starting out bonsai in the 80s, early 80s. I was pretty young. But it has a lot of history in horticulture, and there's a lot of reality to it as well. That you have a young plant, let's say, you have a little tomato plant or something like this, and the tomato plant has just a few roots. It's been growing in this little plug maybe, and you're trying to plant it into the ground or something like that. And you make a mess of the root system while you're doing that. Well, the roots have just been really marginalized, and it can help a little plant like that doesn't have a lot going for it. It doesn't have a lot of roots, doesn't have a lot of top, but if you take a leaf or two off, you can help balance out the top, the root to shoot ratio. Now, I thought that translated with perfect ease to old bonsai, and I was wrong. That doesn't really work. When I got to Japan, we hardly did any trimming in the springtime. It was all repotting. All we did was concentrate on repotting, and I didn't really understand why. So one of the things that was very interesting for me to discover in researching for this book was how conifers and deciduous plants, angiosperms, how they store food on different levels. So conifers store very little. The evergreen conifers store not very much in the way of your sugars and starches. Starches is what the sugar turns into in the wintertime. And deciduous trees, on the other hand, store quite a few of these in the ray cells, the carbohydrates produced by the leaves. So it has a greater ability, it has a bigger foundation on which to regrow. The conifer doesn't. In Japan, I can't remember a single time that we cut a pine or a juniper in the springtime. On the other hand, a light trim is certainly possible with an older deciduous tree. And so that was very interesting to see new research coincide with what the tradition has been doing all along. This is a fairly short chapter. There's some resources in the book if anybody's curious about some of the details of this. I do have some references there. Renee, are there any questions on this chapter?
No questions at this time.
Okay, great. Yet another one that I thought was a fairly obvious thing. If you want a bigger plant, thicker trunk, you put it into a bigger pot. So when I first started out in bonsai, I would make that leap all at once and put it in a really big pot. And it took me years to realize, after sort of staring at these little things that were sort of languishing there, that it wasn't working. Something was going wrong. And what I didn't realize was that I was making too big a leap at once. So that if you take a small plant and you put it into a pot that's twice the size of the one that you're taking it out of, you actually keep the maximum momentum of that young plant. So this is sort of for those of you who like to grow cuttings and grow seeds and things like that, anything kind of small. This idea, I wish I had known this years ago, because it would have grown things a little faster. Bonsai is slow, so at certain points of depending upon what we're working with, we want to speed it up. At other points, like when we have older bonsai and we're trying to create ramification, we might want to be slowing it down. But if we upsize too quickly, then we can inadvertently slow down a plant when we're trying to speed it up. Why is it? Why does that happen? Well, if a plant is in a small plug, I've talked with growers about this and found some research that supports all of that what they said, but they were saying that a small plant in a small amount of soil, that turnover, that wet to dry cycle is really fast. And so what you have is a situation in the root system where you have air being drawn into the soil mass very quickly, and that's bringing in oxygen. Roots respire, just like the tops do. All cells on the plant respire and need oxygen. So if it's constantly soggy, which is what would happen if you had, can everybody see my little cursor here? If you have this little plant here on top in this big pot, this pot's never really going to dry out, and the plant is probably going to grow very, very slowly. So that's one reason. And then there's a couple other things. A shrub is going to fill out a pot much slower in most cases than so something like an azalea, then or quince, then let's say if you had some sort of tree like a pine or like a maple in particular, just fill out a pot pretty rapidly. So there's a little division, right? Shrub and tree. Let's see. I just want to give a little plug for Sergio here. When he sent this to me, I nearly fell over. I was laughing so loud. I have never met Sergio. But I believe he's one of the funniest people I've never not met. This is this is absolutely hilarious. He is an animator. He worked for many years for Nickelodeon. And so this was kind of a fun project for him because he hasn't worked in sort of still imagery for quite a while. But we had a lot of fun with creating all this stuff. All we did was agree on which chapter to illustrate. I didn't give him ideas at all, except that there was only one, and I had an idea for the cover. But how he expressed that was all him, and he always made me laugh. It's so unexpected. Renee, are there any questions for this chapter?
No questions, but I've had comments. People love the illustration.
Yeah,
They really love the illustration, so that's
great. We're thinking of making posters or T-shirts or something out of some of Sergio's drawings. They're really remarkable. So another chapter. Growth enhancers is another thing that we, including myself, get all excited about. And all of that is enhanced by, of course, all these hydroponic stores showing up everywhere, and having all of us suddenly learn all the secrets of the people who've been growing marijuana for the last several decades. They've really been on the leading edge of a lot of things. I guess where the money goes, so there also goes some inventiveness. And I learned some things about this stuff. The growth enhancers is a real wide bandwidth. Some of these stories are really pretty fun. B1 is probably the most fun story. But first of all, I wasn't able to find any body. There was one or two studies, but it just wasn't enough to really comment on for Super Thrive or HB101. I figured if there were scientists, even in Japan, which is where HB101 comes from, if they were working on it, it would be in English, but I wasn't able to find anything. Both of these are pretty old products. I thought HB101 wasn't that old, but it's only kind of new here. Super Thrive is ancient. That goes back many decades. And I don't know. It's possible that scientists and universities just aren't interested in risking a lawsuit because these are brand names. On the other hand, B1 is thiamine. B1 is it's a vitamin. And this is a crazy story. I actually had to buy an article for $35 written by a scholar who put down all of the backstory of B1, which was crazy reading. I didn't know any of this, but it goes all the way back to the 1930s, where an endocrinologist a plant biologist thought he had found a new hormone. And that would have been huge news because, we have a handful of them, but, they're not that common, to find a new one. So he thought he had found something that enhanced growth. He was really excited about it. And he got some companies excited about this who were funding his research. And somehow in the first year or two, Better Homes and Gardens got wind of this. And it came out in a little ad. Later, they put out a several-page article about him and the work he was doing, and it mushroomed into this huge fad that goes on today. There you can find B1 sold by many different companies. This is the only one I was willing to speak strongly about because I did have lawyers advise me on this one, but I'm not liable for speaking my mind, apparently. It is apparently, and this was discovered only 3 years into his research, that actually it isn't what he thought it was. So the researchers understood this was nothing, but the people buying the product didn't. And that's been going on for decades. So anyway, B1, you can probably find a better use for it than soaking your roots. In fact, I'm sorry, I didn't explain that for those of you who don't understand, haven't heard what B1 was thought to be used for, which is as sort of a stress reliever when you're repotting. You soak your roots for it or whatever, sprayed on the plant. There's several different things that people thought is something that one could do. One thing that Linda Chalker Scott, this horticulturalist who I interviewed, mentioned that I thought was a really nice summation was that most of these growth enhancers that you can get at hydroponic stores do something. I mean, they all have nutrients in them, but the real question is it worth, spending 4 or 5 times as much for them rather than just buying your normal sort of pedestrian fertilizer? And her answer was no, it doesn't. They don't give any particular benefits. Now that was a very broad comment, and I agree with that. However, there are several that have some very interesting results. Humic acid has been known for decades to create some pretty interesting growth responses. Seaweed is another one. There's cytokinins in there, a hormone that creates budding. There's not a lot of, in terms of nitrogen or whatever, phosphorus, potassium. There's not a lot of that kind of thing. Silicon is one of the most interesting, creating harder cell walls there's research that supports the claim that given those harder cell walls, it can prevent fungal attack and even strengthen plant to resist strong winds and harsh sun, things of that nature. So that's very interesting. But this is where I come up with a question, because if it's hardening a cell wall, will it make our branches more brittle? I don't have an answer for that. So I'm hoping that we can all figure out some studies that for our own use, though it might not impress a scientist, does a branch have greater snappability, for instance, if we have been applying a liquid silicon solution? In any event, so not all of these are snake oil. Growth enhancers do some things, but many of them do things that don't do the things that you might find on a label. If you don't have Super Thrive, it's actually quite fun to have a label just to look at the label. It's old school sort of advertising. It's really fun. Renee, are there any questions here?
No questions so far.
Okay.
Okay.
Copper wire, aluminum wire. This is another one that ended up being more of a war between continents at one point, where Europeans were using a lot of aluminum wire, and some people over here started using copper, and it it ended up being another one of these pointless sorts of conversations, because the Japanese use them both. They think they're different features of both metals that can be very beneficial. I happen to agree with them that copper is probably best for conifers. It has greater strength. It's great to use if you're putting a tree in a show, where you don't want the copper or the wire rather to show off and be garish, and so the small diameter and the subdued color all are in your benefit column. And then long term, I mean, some conifers have wire on for years, so that's another nice feature. Aluminum, on the other hand, seems to be really well suited for deciduous. You lay it on the bark and you don't damage it quite so easily. It's a little bigger. Yeah, it's shiny, and the anodized surface doesn't age, but it's not an issue because you're taking it off in a month and a half anyway. And deciduous trees aren't shown with wire on them, so they seem very well suited for their own little camps. But that's my opinion. I know there are other schools of thought around that, but I think in this instance, I think the tradition has the best arguments. Renee, do we have any questions here?
No questions.
Okay, moving on. Watering. I know this is probably our least exciting thing to talk about, but morning and evening watering, such as we might learn from a master gardener class or something of that nature, can only get us so far, because the problem is that the pot is such a limited real estate, and the plant, given either weakness or strength, is or according to a different species, is going to use up water at a different rate, and we have to be very attentive to that and water it when it needs water, which could be really at any time of the day. So scheduling is going to be a minimal advantage, but it can be advantage if you're away on a break, or like a vacation or midday at work or something like that. You can use it for misting also. But one of the problems with an automatic watering system, although they might seem easier to maintain, right? You have more flexibility in your lifestyle, is that weak trees tend not to soak up water very easily. It's usually, there's a translation there, and the weakness might have started at the top, might have started in the roots, but it ends up in the same place, which is that the plant does not use as much water. And when that happens, if the tree is watered at a consistent schedule, the tree will get weaker and weaker and weaker because of what we talked about earlier with oxygen and with the quick wet dry cycle. The quicker that cycle is, the more vigorous your plant is going to be. So a weak tree on our automatic watering system is going to get weaker. The problem is it can be really hard to see which tree is getting weaker with the fact that you're generally not looking at when the pot is drying out, when there's a little ring around there with a little drip line. So one of the greatest benefits of watering our trees by hand is that it gives us one of the strongest clues about how the plant is doing. It's just like reading your temperature when you go to the doctor or something of that nature. And trees are always changing their schedule. Their water use changes several times during the year according to growth, according to weather patterns. When it gets so hot that they shut down. They're growing in the spring. It seems like they can dry out every few hours because they're using so much water and all the growth and the tissues that they're developing. They need a lot of water for that. And then all of a sudden they stop. If it's a deciduous tree, in the fall, they drop all the leaves. Suddenly they don't use much water anymore. So we have to be very attentive. If you want to use an automatic watering system, you certainly can. I would advise having it off when you're available and there so you can see which things are doing well, which are not, and then kind of reorganize them. Maybe have a bench where you have things that are on an automatic water system only 2 days and have another one which is once a day and 2 times a day or something like that. But get complicated if you want to use automatic watering systems, because the more complications you can create in the watering system, the better you're going to be able to manage many of the multiple needs of our bonsai. Any questions here, Renee?
I do have a question. I have to go back to the wire.
Yes.
Carmen Scott has a question about using copper for tie-down wire.
Oh, for the root ball.
Yeah.
Yeah. Copper wire is strong, so it can be tempting. I have seen some strange results with copper. I see some of the soil staining. It'll turn green, and then I don't see a lot of roots around it. Yet iron is not as bad. First of all, it doesn't seem as toxic. Iron. So I'm sorry, steel. So stainless steel, but stainless steel will erode and break eventually. So if you're going to use steel, which is your strongest wire, try and have it coated with plastic. You can find that at some specialty hardware stores. You can use aluminum. Aluminum's funny. It's not very strong, but it's pretty inert. And you can just upsize it, use slightly larger 2.5. 3 doesn't get through your average size screen hole though. So 2.5 is about as big as you can get. Aluminum is funny. It doesn't seem to be toxic, but it does break down over a few years. You can find little pits in it. But to answer you, a quick answer is copper isn't really the preferred wire. If you have a really heavy tree and you don't have steel, you could probably use copper, but maybe try and slip something over it. Any other question there?
Yeah, I have a watering question.
Yes.
This is from Alice. If you're trying to duplicate nature, would morning be wetter? And you would try to duplicate that with a misting?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's an interesting point, because many plants can hydrate through their leaves, through their foliage, and especially a stressed out plant can really benefit from having water on the leaves as long as possible. Of course, we always get into, we could get a fungus or something like that if we do too much. But if you have weakness already, that might really help. As far as, it kind of mirrors nature, though. In Japan, the idea of hamizu, which is leaf watering, is usually done late in the day. It's like late afternoon to kind of cool down the plants, and it gives them a little opportunity to soak something up through the leaf, perhaps. That's an interesting question. Yeah, sort of biophilic watering is a really interesting idea. But misting, a misting system for a weak plant can be really useful. Plant that where the roots aren't working. I mean, that's what horticulturalists will use for something that they're growing cuttings that don't have roots yet. The foliage will take in the water that keeps the plant going before it has roots, for instance. And the longer it stays on there, the better. So I'm repeating myself, but the cooler the temperature, the more you're going to be able to soak something in. It'll stay on there a little longer. Interesting idea. Any other questions, Renee?
I have one from Kathleen O'Donnell. She
Yeah.
asked, do you recommend watering more if wind is expected or if freezing is expected?
Oh, really good question. Yeah, your wind can definitely add one watering per day. Absolutely. Curiously, if it's really severe wind, sometimes the plant will shut down and the stomata will close. It can be almost like high heat when the plant does the same thing. So just always watch the soil. But yes, it can definitely desiccate plants. Absolutely. And then freezing, yes, frost is desiccating. And if you know a frost is coming or freezing is coming, water your plants. Don't worry about breaking your pots. Water some hours beforehand. Get your plant hydrated. Get your soil hydrated, because water protects the roots. It gives off a little heat actually when it freezes, which is kind of counterintuitive, but but it does give off a little bit. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think in general, we I'm using these big words, we who's we. But what I notice is that many students of mine tend to keep their trees a little too dry in the wintertime, especially around freezing temperatures. They should be watered for sure. Any other questions?
I have a
Renee?
question on pH.
Oh boy.
pH of your water.
Oh, a question of what? Okay, so ideal pH would be somewhere in the 6 to 7 range. 6.5 is maybe, if you were to pick one number, that's fairly ideal, because it handles a huge range of plants. So unless you're talking about a cactus, or only growing cactus, or only growing Satsuki azaleas, you're gonna keep most things really pretty comfortable in 6.5. And the various ways of controlling or altering the pH to get down or get up to 6.5. And I cover some of that in the book, but you can add an acid if you're too basic, if you're like 8 or 9 or something like that, which this is exponential, by the way. It's like 100 times more every time. So anyway, try and get your pH right. It'll provide a lot of stress relief for your plant, because nutrient take-up can be greatly affected by pH that's too far off. So you can add acid if it's too high, or you can add some baking soda if it's too low, and try and bring it up to 6.5. Yeah. There's more in the book about that. I've also written a blog post about that sort of thing. Any other questions there?
That's all for now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, we're moving on to part number 2, aesthetic myths. There are a few of those. Bar branches. So I don't know if you guys can see me. I turned my little video off, but let's say this is a trunk, and a bar branch has is coming opposite another one. So it looks like a little T. And bar branches in the tradition are not considered the best option, because they fly in the face of asymmetry. They make something that looks a little bit too balanced. And bonsai is, if you were maybe to sum it up, the art of finding balance in asymmetry. It's a little trickier to do. But opposite branches, sometimes we don't have as many choices as we might want. We might have a really thin tree. We might have a tree that has 3 branches on it. And then if you cut one of them off, you don't have much of a tree left. So a couple of ideas. If you need to keep a bar branch, keep one smaller. On the opposite side, maybe try and push one to the back, so that's a little bit less obvious. Also, when we are talking about shohin, another thing to speak of the big we, I think in the West, we tend to, or have tended to in the past, be so married to these rules that we're cutting everything that's even close to opposite away, and we end up with a thin tree. If you go to Japan, or if you see some images from particularly shohin trees, which is a very small tree, it's under 7 inches, or a chuhin tree, which is under 15 inches, especially those sizes, Japanese trees are thick. They're full of branches, many of which are near opposite or opposite, and they don't worry about that. So I think we have a density problem. Yeah, we have a thinness problem, really. But one way we can mitigate that is to just put this this one rule not to the side, but under strict review, so that it doesn't rule us and rule the beauty, the density of our trees. I say asymmetry is still important. Don't throw that one out. Any questions here, Renee?
No questions.
Okay, great. So another rule, which some of you might be familiar with, or guideline, I should say, is about pocket branches. And pocket branch, if this is your trunk here, can everybody see this? I don't see my video anymore. Everybody see my hand?
I cannot see anything.
I can see it.
Where are we seeing it, Renee? On the side?
If you have a little video out, you can see it. But this is the only time that you're going to possibly find use for this, because I'm trying to make a little thing with my hand, trunk line. So anyway, if you have your little video there, you can see hopefully my hand. And a pocket branch is going to be where you have this concave curve in your trunk, and your branch is coming out of the inside of this branch. Typically, that can look a little claustrophobic. So this is one of the taboo branches, one of the ones you're not supposed to have. And it's a problem. I mean, like all of these guidelines, 90% of the time, we want to try and avoid these things. However, pocket branches, sometimes we have to leave them. Again, the very thin tree, with not many branches, or a yamadori, something that we've collected, something from the mountains, we may have to leave branches that we might not have designed that way, but we might have to use them anyway. So balance is very important. Balance over rules. If you want to sum that up, one thought is that trees that don't have much in the way of concave, sort of very severe kind of curves that have a really slow curve, or is just a very minimally sinuous sort of tree, they don't really feel like they have pockets. And so those areas sort of open up, and you can have branches that come out of those shallow curves and not have it look so claustrophobic. So there's one instance. I'm going to make one more of these guideline rules, and then I'm going to have a bigger rule. So these are like secondary rules. I'm going to make this point once more. Renee, do we have any questions here?
No questions here.
Okay. All right. So pigeon breast is my third little guideline, just as an example. There are more of them, but a pigeon breast is a movement on the upper trunk toward the viewer. So you can think of it, or you can imagine, or you can look at this photo here of the pigeon that's very, very boldly sort of coming toward us. Now, Japanese have never really appreciated this feeling, sensing that it's a little too bold, it's a little too confrontational, and that a bonsai, they wanted to be very welcoming. So the trunk kind of moves away from the viewer, and then the very top comes forward, like the head of the pigeon can move forward a little bit. So that's a little more welcoming. That is their sensibility. It's sort of a national sensibility. And I think it's fascinating that they were able to create a visual representation of that. I think that's really neat. On the other hand, again, 90% of the time, you might really want to take this guideline into consideration. However, in tree design, we're often working with things that are like found objects. They came from a mountain, and they knew nothing about Japanese traditions, and yet we want to make a bonsai out of them. And you might find the best trunk line of that tree is one where the top part of the trunk comes toward the viewer. This is really kind of common. It happens about 1/4 of the time, actually. And you might want to consider this as a difference between passive design, which is sort of a Japanese traditional framework, and an active design, which could be an international framework. And to be fair, the Japanese were also discovering that pigeon breasts occasionally are necessary if we're to talk about the best front, the best trunk line. I'm gonna come to that. I'm gonna make that point a little stronger in just a little bit. But one thing that we don't really easily see in a two-dimensional photo, if you haven't been to Japan, if you're looking at these photos, you might not realize that many of the trees that were collected in Japan and have been made into beautiful bonsai actually have pigeon breasts. So anyway, they do happen over there. And I think it might have been very difficult for us to understand in our two-dimensional, what we had to look at, some decades ago, was 2 dimensions, and we couldn't see these things. And so I think we tend to be married to these secondary guidelines very, very tightly, when in fact they're really just to keep into consideration. But read the tree, not the book. Renee, any questions regarding pigeon breasts?
No questions.
Okay. All right. So the front. We're all very excited about the front, and we should be. The front is the most important decision that I have to stop here. Just this illustration cracked me up. I had no idea how he was going to illustrate this, and I couldn't have come up with something as genius as this in a million years. But he's got, the fronts that didn't work. The S is, the best front, and then there's T, A, and D in the background. He's a mad genius. Okay, so an S curve is something that strangely we seem kind of hardwired to put into our trees, and also to see them, to see as the most movement. And this is what I would challenge you to look a little differently at. So an S curve is a lot of movement. That's true. It's also very often a kind of a mesmerizing, somewhat boring movement. So if you turn your tree a little bit, you might find more three-dimensionality to it. You might find something that breaks up the S, and that will give a little more character to the plant. But one of the things that I would like to talk about is how your front of the tree is your primary decision. It's your primary sort of guideline to find an interesting trunk line, with all of the important, trunk flare and interest and taper and things of that nature. And that the rules that came before this, your pigeon breast and your bar branch, these are rules that are actually secondary rules, and your first rule really is the front. So in other words, if you have a front showing off a pocket branch or a pigeon breast, if it is still the best front, if it has the best movement, that should be your front. Don't throw it out and choose a less interesting, that's what I was going after, front, because you feel so tightly attached to those secondary rules. Then we're going to end up with a less interesting bonsai at the end of the day. I find that, and maybe you folks find this as well, but when you're wiring a branch and then you start bending it, you bend the branch in one direction and then you bend it in the other, and we just created an S curve. And it seems like when we start our little young saplings, we do the same thing. They all look like these sinuous little things. You look at the Satsuki azaleas, there are all these little sinuous S curves. I think we could ask more. I think S curves are not all that interesting, and maybe you completely disagree. But I think T, A, and D are far more interesting as fronts. And I encourage you to find different letters. Anyway, Renee, do we have any questions?
Yes, I have a question from Carmen Scott. Her question is,
Yes.
I've heard the phrase dynamic tension used. What
Ooh.
does that involve? Also,
Wow.
right-left orientation.
Right, yeah, okay, all right. Yeah, right, left, absolutely. This is another huge, I'll take that one first. The joined decision when we choose a front is actually three parts. One is the trunk line. And then the second one is going to be your inclination, how much of a tip you give that front. And then the third one, all of which we should figure out on the first day when we're designing our tree. The third one is going to be flow. Does it go to the right or does it go to the left? So by go, I mean in display, is this tree going to have the asymmetry place its weight in the right direction or the left? Meaning where then are you going to put your accent plant if it's in display? Is it going to be on the right or the left? All that we should have a good idea of. And it's hard to do. I mean, we have to imagine a lot. There might be all kinds of foliage there that's actually missing, but we have to imagine, okay, that's where we're going with this because it's going to balance this other movement on the front. So the second one was, I'm sorry, what was it? Dynamic
tension.
Dynamic tension. Yeah, tension is a very important concept in any visual art. You can talk about dance even. You see it most easily in modern dance, but it's used in all dance. Sculpture, painting, everything, even architecture. But tension is probably in bonsai is most easily seen regarding the placement of the nabari, the trunk, the lower part of the bari, the takiagari. Where does that weight? So right in the middle is generally going to have this sort of stasis and no tension. Years ago, decades ago, the bonsai was placed about 1/3 from one side and 2/3 to the other. In fact, you can find literature from the 70s and the 80s saying that. This is almost like the golden section kind of proportion, 5:8. And it's an incredibly beautiful feeling for many things. For bonsai, it seems to be really, really obvious. It's way over on one side and there's a lot of room on the other. There are two reasons why this is not as good. And in fact, the tradition has moved away from that idea and the tree has become closer to the center. It's not in the center, it's just slightly off. Sometimes it's only 1/2 inch off on a 12-inch pot or 15-inch pot, but it can be really, really obvious still which way the front is, but there's more tension. Another reason why it is horticultural. So if you have a plant way over on one side, half of the tree has its roots being limited by the side of the pot. And then you might end up getting some physiological problems with branches growing weaker on one side. It's a possibility. It's less likely to happen on a conifer, which can kind of share fluids right and left, but deciduous trees don't work so well that way. So anyway, that was a long answer, but it's a really interesting question. And it's a little easier to talk about if we're all seeing the same thing. So I'll stop there, but that's a great question. Any more, Renee?
That's all for now.
Okay, great.
Actually, Renee, I was trying to type a question and I didn't get it in time. So may I just speak the question?
Sure.
I was trying to ask if there's one thing is more outweighs the other in terms of, is it best to show the nabari that has the widest portion of the tree, or is it best when you look at it, you usually can't get both, or is it better to show where you've got the movement, or is it just kind of go case by case, or?
It is case, but yeah, you ended it well.
Okay.
One of my favorite David DeGroat phrases is "it depends,"
Okay.
and it's just wonderful when both of those things line up. We get the widest Nabari, the widest lower trunk, and the most movement, and we go out and we raise a pint of beer or whatever. It's very exciting, but we don't always get that, right? So it's case by case in the sense of what kind of tree do we have? Is movement important for this species of tree? And that might surprise some people, but there's some plants that really kind of need movement. You can't A formal upright Japanese maple, for instance, is not a thing. It doesn't feel right. You can have a formal upright conifer, and it can feel great. So there, if you're maybe if you're, to put it one way, if your movement is not as interesting as this crazy Nabari that's a little better at 25 degrees rotated, go with a Nabari. So yeah, here again, if we're not looking at the same thing, no, but you hit it. It's case by case. This is where we all become artists. I want to see what you're interested in about the tree, and this is your chance to do that. It's the same kind of question as, what is the color of the pot? Are we going to use color complements, which I think are neutralizing? I don't really like color complements. That's a color right opposite the color wheel, like green and red, the Christmas colors. I find they neutralize. On the other hand, if you do something near it, off, kind of slanted off to the side, you develop some tension. And then if you change the value, so we're talking about tension again, right? So we change the value. So that's dark to light, your grayscale, right? So if you have a medium red flower, and you have, let's just take green. If you have a green pot and you decrease the value of it so that I might be going the wrong way, but anyway, we darken the value of it to the point that it's a really dark green, that flower is going to pop. It's not going to be neutralized anymore. So it develops a different kind of tension. But you might see these things differently than I do. I want to see what you see. But these questions, these decisions that we make, all allow us to show off the feature of the tree that we're interested in. Is it the flower? Is it the trunk? The movement of the trunk? Is it this amazing Nabari and the heck with the rest of it? I want to see what you're interested in. Always case by case, right? And we're one of those cases. How we see. I think just as a general statement, I think we're all on these sensual islands. I think I have no idea how other people see. I'm kind of fascinated by the whole question. I have had an apprentice who was colorblind, and it was amazing to talk to him about what he sees. So, okay. Renee, any other questions crop up?
That's all. Well, that's all for now.
Okay. Okay, great. Another one. More movement, more sexy, more better. I think we're very attracted to a sinuous kind of line or an erratic, energetic line, and that can be really a lot of fun. I do have some opinions about this, though. I have some very energetic plants in my backyard, and I love them. I think if every single plant of mine was crazy jazzy and had a tempo that was going a million miles a moment, to give a music analogy here, I'd probably get a little exhausted. And so it's only one thing. If you have a high need for that, though, your benches maybe should be populated with a lot of those. But I think it's fun to mix things up and to listen to different kinds of music at different times of the day. And the same kind of thing goes with, the posts that support our bonsai well, not the posts, but let's say we have 6 posts supporting different bonsai. Let's have each one of them telling a little bit of a different story. One of the things that really surprised me, and I did not know this until I spent many times at good bonsai shows, went through many gardens in Japan, is how memorable and quiet and powerful some very, very simple trees were. Trees that had almost no movement. Some of them weren't necessarily formal uprights, but neither were they really jazzy. And I came to understand why trees like that could win an award over a tree with a lot of movement. But I think we tend to simplify. Here again, I'm using the royal we, all of us in the West, that a tree with more movement, is a better one. And I think maybe we learned this in our first club meeting, when we went and potted up our first tree or went to a nursery, and that might be where we start. But I think it can also be where we end, which would be sad. I think. So the older the tree is, you don't necessarily have to go to Yamadori to see this, but even an old potted bonsai, one that's lost a few branches or whatnot, but maybe it isn't a tree with an awful lot of movement. Maybe it has almost no movement, and yet over time, that tree has gained some characteristics that a young tree doesn't have. And I think this is one of the points that it's hard to get away from. If you have a young whip, you put a lot of movement in it because the only thing it has is movement. I mean, it's the only thing it can do. If you have a little straight stick, in 100 years, it could be really interesting. We're not going to be around to see that. So the older the tree is, the less rules can guide us, for sure. Japan's many of Japan's really, really famous trees, award-winning trees, a couple of the trees that have actually done the slam and have won the 3 big awards have almost no movement whatsoever. Renee, any questions here?
No questions.
Okay. All right. We've had some great ones. One of my favorite novelists is Mr. Zafong, passed away recently, sadly. He wrote several amazing, very dreamy sort of books. But in any event, when I read this, I almost fell over laughing because it reminded me of our community and how we talk too much. Humans aren't descended from monkeys; they come from parrots. I thought he hit us pretty well there. And then our friend Gary Wood. Who helped out for many years down in Telpurian Farms that sadly was lost in the fires last summer. But he had this great phrase, which I think is so applicable to bonsai. Doing it right takes a long time, but doing it wrong takes forever. He's a very wry fellow. This was a final little thing that Sergio sent, which I thought was hysterical as the opposite of the cover, the burnt out match that we did find some use for it. I think we put it in the front matter of the book. But I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you. And I did want to throw out a thanks to the book team that put this together. Mary Russell, who is actually a bonsai person up in Minnesota, and helped me with Post Dated, my first book. Sergio Kwan, of course, we've been talking about. This was hilarious. I'm a Star Trek fan, and he had a little bonsai Star Trek. Jennifer Omner, who created the design for the interior, and my mom, who helped with the bibliography. Laura Nelson, who was our proofreader, and then people like Jonas, and I think we had 9 other content editors that kept me from making a complete idiot of myself. So. Thanks to all of them. And thank you to you. These are some great questions. I'd be happy to keep talking with you a bit if you had any more.
Yes, if anybody have questions, please speak up. We've got this wonderful resource here. Let's not let him get away without taking full advantage of it.
Uh-oh.
Let's see. I have just a thank you. Dwayne Barrett from Fresno. Thank you from Fresno. Kathleen O'Donnell. Is he still having sessions at his place? Do you still?
Oh, yeah. We had seasonal classes, sort of like Boone's intensives up here in Portland, and we had 3 people at a time, and we did shutter that last year. I'm not sure when that's going to open. It might be later this year, maybe later in the summer again. We're still looking at people's comfort level and all of that. Yeah. But we have been having, last year was a very, very busy year. We created a series of online courses called the Seasonal Light Program, and I'll be giving all of those this year as well. Again, they were a lot of fun. We had a lot of internationals come in on that, and so it was fun to make some acquaintances overseas.
I do have a question from
Yeah.
Michael Jensen Akula, you talk about fall pruning leading to more proximal budding than spring pruning. Can you expand on this?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's a very subtle thing, but it's something that is interesting to talk about. I think you can cut it. Many plants you can cut it like 3 times a year. You can cut when you repot, which can give you some shoot growth. One thing that I find if you do that, well, let me finish this first. Then you can cut after growth is ended, which for me is around June, and then the first flush, and then you can cut in really early fall when you still have some time for the plant to respond to that. So you can cut kind of at 3 times a year. It's a great question. If you have, first of all, one division, if you have a young plant, let it grow all season long because you're trying to build tissue. You're trying to create your tree. And it would be sort of like repotting the tree halfway through the growing season. You can do it, but it's also going to stall out the plant. Then if you cut in the spring, usually what you're going to find is that you have a huge imbalance in hormones. You have all of this resource down below, and it's going to go throwing up into fewer areas it can run into, right? And so it's going to push even harder there. So we're going to get really long internodes. That's generally what happens when we cut in the spring. If you cut in, well, let me talk about the fall first, and I'll come back to late spring. That cut. So in the fall, if you were to cut early fall, if you guys aren't in a frosty area, but if you did that some 2 months before you got, the tree totally stops doing anything, then the plant can respond to that. And usually what it does, because it has an overflow of cytokinins coming up, there's an imbalance of cytokinins, which are in the roots that come up, they produce buds. They will sit there until the spring, and then they'll be ready to grow. So you end up with generally more ramification if you cut in the fall, which then grows in the spring, than if you cut in the spring. If you cut in late spring, early summer, or something like that, after the growth has hardened off, you get kind of a mix of both of those two responses. And these are kind of subtle, and you might not see this with all species, but in general, those ideas are there. If you talk with somebody who works in orchards, if they want extension, they cut in the spring. If they want budding, they cut in the fall. It's a great question. Yeah, I think I was referring to a post I just did. Yeah. Any more, Renee?
No questions, but a lot of thank yous for a wonderful program. Come on, guys, you have, not much time left here.
You can probably unmute yourself at this point. If you had a question, we could just do it that way.
I'm gonna stop your share here.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great.
I do have a question. What do you use for your conifer soil?
Conifer soil, yeah. So I do use the Japanese direction with soils, so the volcanic particles of of akadama and pumice, and sometimes I use lava, but it's mostly akadama and pumice. I have seen and continue to hear of strange reports of lava with deciduous trees. So I don't use much of that. I grow a lot of deciduous trees, and it's just easier to grow plants in kind of the same thing in one yard. So, but as far as proportions go, I'm kind of trending toward 50% akadama. I don't want to be using that much, but I see the best sort of balance of economics and root growth. You can go more than that. The Japanese use 70% akadama and the rest a bit of pumice and lava. So anyway, that's sort of the traditional mix. But I think the Boone's mix, the 3-part mix, 1/3 akadama, 1/3 pumice, 1/3 lava, is a pretty good conifer mix. I think it maybe doesn't hold quite as much moisture for deciduous trees, but so many of our trees are so thin, we want to build them, we want them to be strong. That's a pretty good mix. But there again, I have a couple things I'm not too fond of with lava. One thing is that it's really, really hard, and it can dull your tools. It can chip your scissors, and I like being able to cut through soil and root at the same time with a shears. So So maybe I have some particular needs, but but anyway, but I use Akadam and pumice for deciduous trees as well. Yeah. Soil size is something you could talk about. I use a slightly larger soil size, which is I don't know, it's about 3/16 of an inch or something like that. For conifers, maybe 1/8 inch or so for deciduous. I'm kind of futzing with sizes a little bit, but just a hair bigger for conifer. But also if you use the Japanese soils, I'm sorry, I'm getting very far away from your question. Stratifying is really important. Make sure you have, you know, a little finer soil on top, not dust, but maybe a little finer. You're in kind of a hot area, and then sphagnum moss on top of that. Even on your conifers, I think that might give an advantage. But I think Jonas would be able to advise you a little bit better on that. Yeah, thanks for the question. Anyone else?
Last chance.
It's a very polite group. I mean, most groups are just like,